So as a person who's been active in the Bluey fandom for almost 5 years? Yeah, really. I've seen my fair share of interesting things. But as I've continued to produce content related to the show, I've also begun to notice somewhat of a trend over the past year or so, which is that my content has been kinda dropping in views. Now, with that said, it could just be people moving on, my new content not having as much mass appeal, or simply viewers getting sick of my constant use of the word however, but overall, this decline has kinda left me a bit puzzled. Because from a basic standpoint, the show is arguably more successful than ever before, getting collabs and new attention left and right, with some merchandise being so sought after at this point that a select few have resorted to scalping or even stealing in order to cash in on the demand. Which could honestly be its own entire video. However, darn it, I did it again. But anyways, even in spite of this financial success, it should be noted that changes are still happening behind the scenes. As of right now, the show, while planned to get more content, eventually is actually on somewhat of a hiatus, with Joe Brum and Ludo Studio putting most of their focus on the upcoming movie set to release in 2027. With the former himself basically saying that he'll only consider returning to the show if he has ideas on par with Season 3. An admittedly pretty high bar if you've seen it, which depending on what happens here, could have major effects on the show and its future. And although these so-called droughts in new content are perfectly fine, as shows like Bluey do take a long time to make and require a lot of effort, we can't deny that it does cause the fandom to drift apart in some form, which can lead to some bizarre situations. And on the subject of the fandom, as it's continued to grow and develop, it's also gone through its own fair share of trials and tribulations, some of which have given the community an unfortunately pretty negative reputation, and all of this combined made me seriously consider a question that I've been pondering for a while. Is the Bluey fandom cooked? Or at least, dying in some form. And today, we'll try to figure out exactly that, and see as to why I think the fandom is in some form of decline, and why it has, at least in my opinion, gotten even worse to some extent. Also, by the way, before we start though, just a quick heads up, I want to mention that this video will briefly cover or discuss some more serious problems within the fandom, albeit in limited detail, so there's nothing like personal or really messed up. But even if the mention of that sort of thing might still make you uncomfortable, or might bring up some bad memories, I would strongly recommend watching another video from this channel. But for those who are still here, without further ado, let's begin. Okay, so right off the bat, we need to first establish what kind of reputation the Bluey fandom has. And to put it simply, it's not very good. I mean, just for fun, I looked up Bluey Fandom on Google to start with this video, and I kid you not, the first or second autofill was literally just the word toxic, which really says a lot about how people see this community. And on sites such as YouTube, it's easy to find many videos discussing the subject, with some questioning if this is gonna be the next brony fandom, which, if you know anything about that fandom, or even stumbled into it as a young kid like I did, that's not exactly a compliment. But with that said, is the fandom really this toxic, horrific cesspool like its reputation claims? And honestly, to put it bluntly, I would say yes, albeit to some extent. Because as a person who's been active in it for almost half a decade, I've met an incredible amount of super nice and chill people, many of whom I've actually become great friends with, and some who have really helped me through some pretty difficult times. But with all of that said, I still can't deny the fact that things can also get really chaotic too. Of course, there's stuff like shipping wars, unhinged fanfiction or art with odd details or themes, aka deviantart type of stuff. You know, usual fandom shenanigans. But on top of that, there's also just a whole lot of infighting. Every week there's seemingly some kind of new situation on places like the Bluey subreddit, with the latest incident I know being someone who had a theory that Bandit had ADHD because he was like forgetful or disorganized, which the uploader related to, but then it basically turned into a whole massive argument as some other people became upset with this, saying that they were overthinking it, and that this wasn't enough ground to diagnose him and so forth, followed by someone else making a separate post, seemingly mocking the whole situation? Which, while presumably an attempt to add to the conversation, also just came off as kinda rude if you ask me. And in general, this type of activity, along with its fiery or snarky arguing, isn't even that rare. I mean, lest we all forget the whole drama around people complaining about the so-called furry art style being used in fan art, which is pretty much its own controversy altogether. But yeah, who knew that having a bunch of active, energetic Zoomers, tired millennial and Gen X parents, and out-of-touch boomers in one area was gonna cause arguments? Who could have guessed? By the way, no shade towards any particular people in those groups. My grandpa is actually a boomer and he's honestly the most chill dude I know. But regardless though, I think these examples show that, okay yeah, Reddit doesn't exactly bring out the best in some people when it comes to debates, but also that the Bluey fandom, when not completely united by one show, is actually pretty disconnected. Because with Bluey's universal appeal, you get a lot of people with different thoughts and different beliefs. And while this normally should be a great thing, with the way the internet is, it instead just leads to a lot of arguments, causing the fandom to instead be broken up into many small groups, who without a center point such as new content directly from the show, mainly keep to themselves, and occasionally spar with others on sites like Reddit or Twitter. And speaking of the latter, if you also happen to frequent Twitter or X, my deepest condolences if you do. You've probably seen your fair share of people in this fandom getting cancelled or at least called out. And honestly, at first, you could just chalk it up to creepy people being all around the internet and doing creepy things. But if I had to guess as to why this happened in this particular fandom more than a couple times, I think one issue comes from the fact that with Bluey's audience, there's a lot of teens and young adults in this fandom, a small group of whom honestly aren't exactly the most mature or even just in the right state of mind, but also of course kids. And let's be honest, these demographics usually don't mix well, especially when stuff like super violent fanfics or adult art gets posted, which is not hard to find on the internet, even by accident or with filters. And I think this point is also interesting to bring up because after releasing my Bandit's Belt video, it got a lot of comments asking like why do kids or family show fandoms get the weirdest or darkest stuff? And honestly, I believe the root cause is basically what I just mentioned, with it being a bad combination of angsty teens, immature adults, and impressionable kids. Although with all that said, while I think this is a cause for more than a few issues in this fandom, I'll also make it clear that, for the record, something like fandom demographics are not, nor will ever be, a valid excuse for people to prey on or take advantage of others. That's just people not willing to control their sick impulses, or being straight up awful. And on the other hand, also not every adult or teen in a given fandom has bad intentions either. And if anything, most of the really bad activity mainly stems from just a few bad actors taking advantage of an easy target or not exactly being in the right state of mind, especially in comparison to a fandom that primarily has an adult audience or something like that, which overall also usually has the benefit of more mature fans and often a more niche or selective following, which is why you don't really hear about this type of activity from adult-centered fandoms as often. And speaking of bad people in the fandom, there's also one particular activity that I haven't really ever brought up on this channel, but feel that I need to get off my chest and at least mention, which involves the problem of fans in general being targeted online. Not even just including stuff like negative comments, but rather more serious issues such as harassment or even doxing, which I and many others have unfortunately experienced firsthand. Once again, I won't get too deep into this because I know that this topic is still a pretty sensitive one and an issue that still makes a lot of people really uncomfortable. But to make things a little bit more clear, I should note that, at least from what I saw, this activity, contrary to popular belief, isn't really fans attacking other fans, but rather instead a really small group of people against the fandom who more or less acted on bad faith. So with that, it's not like the fandom really engages in this type of behavior, and if anything unanimously condemns it, but regardless, it was still a really serious issue that naturally made a lot of people really uncomfortable, and actually caused many I knew to leave the fandom altogether, both including some casual fans, and even a couple somewhat notable creators. And even with this activity being done by people outside or directly against the fandom, it still doesn't exactly make the community look like a great place to be in, encouraging some to leave or others to avoid joining altogether. And even if you did want to join and were able to ignore everything I just mentioned, the fandom still doesn't really have a great outlook because the first stuff you'd likely see online about it doesn't exactly give the community a stellar reputation either, especially on YouTube. If you know me, you can probably tell where this is going, but when it comes to the modern state of Bluey YouTube, I feel like the videos have gotten way more corporate and honestly worse in every form imaginable. Now, I'm gonna sound like an old man here, but going back to when I first began, Bluey already had a small following on places like YouTube, but it felt like a real dedicated one, with most of the videos at the time often being made by actual fans who just wanted to show their appreciation for this new show. But now, with the subject being much more mainstream and new channels getting into the action, the landscape has greatly changed, with stuff like mindless brain rot, repetitive misleading clickbait, or just poorly produced garbage coming from generic channels who are just cashing in. And while new content or creators being a fan of the show should be a great thing, as people who gatekeep are just a word I can't say on YouTube, it's pretty clear that most of this new content is in fact poorly produced, with clearly little effort, heart, or even sometimes just good intentions.
I don't want to live on this planet anymore.
And not only is this flood of content often poor quality or even deceptive, but it also often takes the spotlight from more genuine creators, many of whom actually do want to have a genuine conversation about the show, or want to propose interesting ideas, like an actual fandom should, but now get little to no attention because they have to always compete with these bigger, generic channels churning out content slop. And if anything, it's kinda like comparing a small business against something like Walmart or Amazon. The latter is easier to access, has way more, and delivers faster, but on the other hand, doesn't really care to serve anything too meaningful or engaging, getting you interested just enough to enjoy or accept it at a very surface level, and more often than not, sacrificing any heartfelt qualities or merit for max revenue or gain, which honestly is kinda just how modern YouTube is in general, and not just a Bluey Fandom problem, but regardless, still one that I believe also contributes to this other idea that the community is not only really cringeworthy and messed up, but also just a bunch of bright and mindless nonsense, and something that isn't worth engaging with on a personal level, even if it absolutely can be. Also, while we're on the subject of Bluey YouTube, I wasn't gonna do this, but just real quick, I wanted to show you the difference in views between the different channels around here. Starting with my own for comparison, looking at the 10 most recent videos, a metric YouTube itself uses for creators, almost all of them don't even reach the 50k mark, with 2 exceptions, and only one that actually surpasses 100k, which is what I personally consider to be a quote-unquote quote-unquote popular video. And yeah, this isn't the end of the world of course, but when compared to the views seen 2 or 3 years ago, it is a very, very notable decline. And going to some other channels, one I wanted to first mention is Pugly, who's honestly what I consider to be one of the better and more genuine creators here. Compared to some other channels, he doesn't have as many videos about Bluey, but hovers just under 50 related to the show, with a majority of them easily reaching 6-digit figures, with some almost reaching 1 million. Although with that said, there are notably a few that do not have very high view counts, with in particular his most recent 3 videos, all gaining less than 30,000 views. A notably large drop from the average. Although with that said, it seems like he hasn't been as active lately, so there's that to consider too. And going to another creator, we also have Aussie girl Margie. She's arguably the most popular creator here in the fandom, with her borderline crazy theory videos usually getting a lot of attention. But even her content is also getting notably less views, with her most recent 5 as of writing this, all getting less than 50,000, with only one 6-digit hit in the last 10. Which honestly, may or may not have had a misleading title and thumbnail. Like, season 4 isn't even out yet. This is just pure speculation and nothing else. And overall, you could argue that it is natural to have less popular videos that fall through the cracks, but when you consider that she has had tons of 6 or even 7-figure hits, and that these have become notably less common, it does still show a downward trend. And in fact, I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but I actually did get a chance to talk to Margie at least somewhat recently, mainly because she reached out to me after I, more or less called her out on that clickbait thumbnail I showed earlier, but thankfully, we don't have like anything against each other or stuff like that, and it actually gave us both a good chance to talk about the current state of Bluey YouTube, with us both basically agreeing that there has been a notable decline, mostly thanks to a lack of official content and interest, but also increased competition from what I like to call faceless or generic channels, such as Cinewave or Tubby Tank, who for comparison, also have quite a few videos with pretty low views, mainly because they just turn out a ridiculous amount every day or week, but they do also have quite a few big hits, which unlike the other creators I've highlighted, do appear to be within the last year or so. Bruh. And I don't know if I'm supposed to mention this, but in our conversation, Margie did also mention that, with her content being the main source of revenue for her family right now, she has considered focusing on content besides Bluey, given the lower demand. Something that, for the record, Pugly also mentioned in a post, and something that I've actually considered myself, because at the end of the day, there's only so much to talk about with this show now. Just about everything has been covered to death, and with new content being far away, as well as numerous channels just milking and recycling whatever little is left, it's honestly not surprising this side of the fandom has run dry, and in my personal opinion, has not only gotten way worse, but also just kinda died from a creative perspective, which I'm sure will only decrease viewership as time goes on, assuming that nothing changes. So with all of this negative activity, drama, and now content farming, I think that to answer my previous question, it's definitely had an impact on the fandom, whether on its reputation, the people leaving, or the people who might have considered joining before. However, with all of that said, I didn't want to make this video to just rant or be a negative fearmonger. We have more than enough of those. But rather, I wanted to also open up discussion on these issues and propose some solutions. Now of course, we can't just change the entire fandom as it's way too broad, but even smaller, personal decisions can go a long way, such as being more open to other perspectives, or just being more careful with what you post, especially if it's not exactly G or PG rated. These are lessons I basically had to learn the hard way during my YouTube journey, and ones that are admittedly kinda obvious, but ones that can go a long way. And on top of that, I also recommend not being afraid to reach out to people who interest you, or even finding something like a server to join if you can find a decent one, as these interactions can be way more chill and positive than just scrolling the main social pages, or the big servers where it's just complete drama and chaos. And regarding watching content, I would highly suggest branching out and giving smaller channels a chance, because yeah, you might come across some random teen dude with the most boring, monotone voice and atrocious mic quality imaginable, but you can also easily find some hidden gems that are actually amazing, especially as these creators are sometimes the most heartfelt and passionate. This might be considered scandalous for me to say, but personally, I don't actually watch that much Bluey content on YouTube because I'm too busy making the content, but just off the top of my head, Nintendo has a few great videos about the show, and as I mentioned many times, was actually the one who inspired me to make my own content, and Pugly is of course, easily just one of the nicest people I've ever worked with, and in my opinion, serves as a great example of how someone can and should engage with a fandom. And with that, I'm sure there's many other creators I'm probably not aware of, mainly because once again, I don't really watch that much Bluey stuff. But if you have any recommendations for underrated channels around this fandom, please feel free to shout them out. And of course, despite all the drama or issues, I can't say that I outright hate the entire fandom, or completely lost hope, because there's still plenty to enjoy, as there are still numerous creators and fans out there, most of whom are actually some of the most amazing, creative, and caring people I've met literally ever. That's not a joke, and easily outpace any negative experiences I've had. Because while the fandom has certainly dropped in popularity, and had its reputation utterly soiled in the eyes of the internet, it's important to remember that there are still many good people out there, even if it's not always obvious. I mean, after all, normal, well-behaved people are often the vast majority, but they rarely make it on the headlines or trending. I'm just saying. But with all of that said, those are my current thoughts on the state of the Bluey fandom. Obviously, there are many issues, and I do believe that there has been an overall decline, but I don't think it's a completely lost cause, and for now at least, still has many redeeming factors that can hopefully save it from a complete destruction. But now, I look forward to hearing what you all think. Do you believe the Bluey fandom has gone on a permanent decline, or has it possibly grown in other ways I didn't see? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and until next time, my name's Hideaki, and I'll be signing out. Goodbye everyone. So for today's art of the day, we have this wonderful drawing by Lilac Cat from YouTube. I didn't see this one until recently, but I still wanted to give it a quick shout out as I thought it was super cute. So Lilac, if you're still watching, apologies for the super late response, and of course, thank you very, very much.